Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Clint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today's guest is Bobby Berkowitz, Managing Director in KPMG's Deal Advisory and Strategy practice, where he leads the compensation solution within people strategy. With over a decade of dedicated M&A experience, Bobby specializes in aligning compensation structures with business performance, particularly during transformative events like mergers, acquisitions, and IPOs. At KPMG, he advises clients across various industries, helping them design and implement executive, broad-based, and Salesforce compensation programs that support organizational goals and ensure compliance. In this episode, we'll explore the complexities of compensation harmonization in M&A, discuss how to navigate job mapping, FLSA compliance, and the cultural impacts of integrating diverse compensation philosophies. Bobby, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Clint. Very excited for this. One of my favorite topics, so excited to be here with you today.
Well, I'm really thrilled because compensation is such a big part of M&A. It goes into the financial model, and I feel like there's really not a lot of information on how to do this well, but we'll get there in a couple of moments. Why don't we start off with you telling your story to our listeners? What do you do now? How did you first get involved in M&A work?
I think you recapped it, what I do now pretty well. Across the board compensation, executive, broad-based Salesforce during M&A, IPOs, other business transformations, but got into the deal space actually during my internship, coincidentally, when I was at Yale New Haven Health Systems. And I was underneath the VP of Compensation and Benefits at the time. And they were in the midst of acquiring St. Raphael's Hospital, which was another hospital within New Haven. So two hospitals, very different cultures, same city, planning to share nurses, doctors, staff across the board. And that experience, even though I was an intern, didn't have true visibility into too much. The dynamics of it really stuck with me. And then at my time at Pearl Meyer, doing board advisory work, whenever there was M&A with our clients, it added that extra layer of excitement. And so when KPMG started their practice, I was one of the first to join with a compensation background and have helped build that over time. And so since have touched over 500 deals in some capacity over the last decade.
That's great. It's one of the things I love about talking with folks in the consulting world. I was asked when I first started HRM&A roundtables, what's the role of consultants? And I'm like, well, what's the role of consultants in our ecosystem, right? It's important sources of knowledge. You see a lot of deals. And so you've seen a lot of what works and what doesn't.
Yes, a lot of those war stories. And as you mentioned earlier, it's part of the financials. And so it's a very sensitive topic for employees, but also for executives within finance, the deal team, really across the board, as it can make or break the deal pretty visibly.
So let's talk about that for a moment. How do you work with deal teams to help them understand the financial implications of their comp decisions?
So it all starts, honestly, during the diligence piece of it and understanding what is that valuation of the organization and where there are going to be potential obstacles. And compensation is one of those elements that can be forgotten in the diligence phase. A lot of times it's focused on windfall payments around employment agreements for the executives or equity holdings, but where the real potential dyssynergies lie are in the broader employee population as you're looking at how you're going to map and harmonize compensation across. And so if you're not accounting for that in your baseline model going into it, there is no budget, and you're putting the talent at risk, the deal thesis at risk, compliance around pay equity at risk. And so really trying to help management teams look at it early, budget for it, and then systematically approach it. So everyone goes in eyes wide open of where the risks are around their decisions, what are their guiding principles, and it all comes back, honestly, to the deal thesis of why are we making these decisions and what are we trying to get out of this transaction?
So I think about the comp model And the ones that I've seen, they always look really great on paper, right? In the spreadsheet, you can make the columns tick and tie. But when you try to apply it to two real organizations with different systems, cultures, histories, how do you see it play out in the real world?
In a variety of ways, and it becomes a very cross-functional work stream. And so from a tactical standpoint, what's nomenclature? How are the systems even configured? Are they going to support the pay models that you're trying to do? Very tactical in nature. From an actual financial standpoint, how are you going to harmonize folks that have various bonus programs, especially in the sales department, their equity eligibility, where one might have more of an ownership culture versus the others? It's very tight around the management team of who gets it. And so how do you balance that? And you mentioned culture. Everything that's decided around compensation tends to impact the cultural integration of the deal. And we all know that culture is a lot of times what makes or breaks a deal. And so how can we use compensation to drive the behaviors we want, help harmonize the organizations, both compensation and benefit wise, but also culturally? And then how can we truly think about this joint organization leading into the future? And so a lot of times it looks like simple math, easy to run some plus minus calculations of how folks sit within salary ranges or bonus targets, but you have to understand the dynamics of how are folks going about their day to day? What have they historically received? One might have better targets, but they haven't funded in 5 years versus the other one is paying above target every single year. And so while the target's simple math to your point, it doesn't tell the whole story. And so let's think holistically around it all. The devil is in the detail, and it all comes out when you're making those tough decisions and working with the C-suite or the board, make those decisions at the aggregate level, but you got to be pretty fluent in what you're seeing in the detail.
I remember a conference I was at a few years ago, and I wish I remembered who said that, but we were talking about harmonization of cultures in it, and he made the comment that salespeople are not coin operated, right? So he was talking about situations where even with a better set of targets or a better bonus plan for people in your go-to-market arena, that just changing those changes the way that these folks think about their jobs. So I'm sure you've seen that. Do you have any other examples of times when the compensation philosophy or the way that it was rolled out affected how people performed in their jobs?
Yeah. I mean, one more exciting or good story is working with this large Fortune 500 company had the slogan, people first mentality. And they truly backed that up as they were thinking about integrating a global organization that was nearly the same size as them. And so as they were looking at different elements of pay that were out of whack, they truly invested in their people and they made the best of decisions consistently throughout. And so it wasn't like you were pulling back equity eligibility, maybe buying out slightly in salary. You were bringing people up to the salary range competitiveness. You were adding into the bonuses. You weren't cutting back pay on the incentives. Granted, did have significant financial implications to it, but their true belief was that if they keep their people engaged, happy, and really bring them in as part of their one company mindset and culture and treat them well, it'll lead to greater productivity and growth in the future. And so that was one of those positive experiences. I've also seen where someone comes in and they say, we're buying this organization. We're a marquee company. They should be happy to now be working for us. But what they don't realize is that people were working at companies of your size or caliber in the past, and they chose to move to a more of a startup or a smaller organization without the red tape, with more autonomy.
Right.
And so they lost that. And on top of that, now you're cutting back different elements of their pay that they were banking on and living on as part of their future. And while you went in eyes wide open, we don't care if we lose a significant amount of people. Rarely do people truly believe that once they start people heading to the door. And then you're retroactively thinking about retention bonuses and paying for just people to stay. And it shifts the entire dynamic where they had that opportunity to reinforce incentives, drive that pay for performance mindset while retaining people, as opposed to you're really just trying to retain people, not even for performance at this point.
It almost sounds like the difference between a proactive investment in those wages, those variables, and a reactive response where you're just trying to stop the bleeding.
Yeah, which comes up more times than not, honestly, in the M&A space, because sometimes it's people's first time for a deal, or they're balancing their day job with the transaction and they don't have time to take a step back, think strategically, or say, I'm going to put in a little extra work on top of all of this to be proactive of how we're going to drive this forward. And ultimately, it becomes reactive, just as much work, if not more work, and a learning experience for a lot of organizations. And so, as you mentioned before, the role of consultant, trying to be that trusted advisor to look around the corners and reinforce this is the time to make these decisions and think about the implications for the workforce in the transaction.
Yeah. I was with a company for some time where we would bring the salespeople over and keep them whole, and not just whole, but keep them on the exact same plan to stabilize the sales funnel. And then at the 1 year mark, we would pull them over to the buyer's comp system. And I remember getting a phone call from one of the sales compensation leaders going, "Hey, something seems to be happening at about the 1 year mark and we're losing people. What do you think's going on?" And I have to admit, it took a moment for me to pick my jaw off the floor. I'm like, what do you think's going on? We're messing with their money.
Yeah.
So of course there's a reaction in that moment. But when you think about the timing of changes to compensation, how have you seen it work well? How have you seen it work poorly? Or maybe it's not timing, maybe it's the way that we communicate, but any tips around when we're starting to mess with people's money, how we manage that?
Yeah, so I think every deal is a little bit different. So there's different dynamics of the year, when it's closing, what's in the purchase agreement, when their merit cycles are, and how does that correspond to the target organizations. But in a lot of cases, I find it helpful to, really sparse out various populations a little bit and think about implications for those decisions. So you talked about the sales team and really focusing on at that 1 year mark, trying to incorporate it. For the sales team specifically, I like to think about all of the different dynamics that are going to potentially change. Are you now changing your brand strategy, your product strategy? Did you buy this organization for that cross-selling component? To have this suite of products now, so people have to learn what they're actually selling in addition to their core that they're used to. And with that, quotas change, territories change, accounts change. And so making sure that you've spent the time thinking about what's your sales go-to-market strategy and all the operating model decisions below it, and then deciding around compensation to reinforce how that new dynamic is going to work, and people then feel empowered of they have this structure and support in place to be successful, and their pay may be different, but it still sets them up for success because of this new model. And so from a timing perspective, try not to be so rigid on that front for the sales team because of all the work that sometimes has to go into that, but really trying to align it at least to going in fresh for the next year. And so you have a month or so of training of everything that's changing, the compensation structure, and then they hit the ground running in Q1 for the sales team. The broader employee population, a lot of times have a maintenance of benefits provision in it as well. And so you have to pay them at least what they were eligible for in the aggregate, or even potentially by pay element.
Right.
And so you don't want to necessarily try and change things before then, especially if you're looking to scale back bonus eligibility or target awards because we're more generous than what your organization does. But what I find really helpful for the broader population is trying to tie it to the merit process. It's when pay is changing already. And so it allows you an extra lever maybe to save money because you're bringing people up their salaries anyway with their merit increase. And so that may save you some money for the folks that were below the range, but it also allows you to be creative of how do you shift to more incentives than salary, because your pay mix is different across organizations. Maybe you found a pay equity issue that you want to try and adjust. Maybe even FLSA, you're switching their exemption status and their overtime eligibility. And so you want to be mindful of that as well. And so by doing it as part of the annual process, there's already a lot of, thought that goes into it, as well as it tied to their performance management program, usually from the year before. And so it has a narrative. And I think you hit on a really good point at the end as well around communications. You can never communicate enough with employees, especially around compensation.
Right.
Complicated for folks to understand, especially when there's equity involved. And so my thought is communicate as much as you can and really lean into simplifying it, educating them, showing them the holistic view of the employee value proposition and how is their pay tied to all of those different things. And if maybe you're lagging the market in certain areas, start highlighting some of those other things that you've invested in, whether it's quicker career paths or benefit programs. And so reminding them what is there in their ecosystem of rewards, not just compensation, can be really powerful as part of that rollout and communication. Sometimes that happens roughly in the year mark, but a lot of times it does vary across the deal timing of close.
Yeah. It's just such an important thing to understand how compensation shapes culture, right? It's what behavior are we rewarding as we go through that, and then making sure that there's really, really clear communication. So you talked a moment ago about FLSA status, and that leads me to start thinking about job mapping and moving folks from an acquired firm into the buyer's job architecture. What does it take to align roles and levels in a way that feels fair and makes sense across the organization?
Yeah, so I think, again, not to use cross-functional too many times, but I think it shows how cross-functional truly compensation has to be in order to get the ROI and to do it right. So job mapping at the beginning can be done in a silo, looking at job descriptions and org charts and census files and any historical survey matches that you might have used. But where it's really important is that should be preliminary. You should work with your HR business partners and even the business leaders directly to truly map what those roles are and get validation from them. One, so that you're more confident in the accuracy. Two, so that they feel like they were brought along for the ride. So there's buy-in. And as employees have questions as it rolls out, they have also confidence in it and are backing it and understand what went into it so that it's a more seamless process and employee experience on it. Around FLSA, it's a really sensitive topic, especially over the last 18 months, where we saw the salary threshold being potentially moved pretty materially higher, which ended up getting rolled back federally. But it was top of mind for a lot of organizations, not even during transactions. And so there were significant cost implications. And so you were seeing it done more and more during the diligence phase to understand where the potential risks were, both from an FLSA compliance, also from a potential adjustment in the costing that might make it into the Q of E adjustments on a run rate basis. So looking at are roles consistently applied their FLSA status, even at just the target company, not even looking at it compared to the buyer as a starting point, because not every organization is viewing an accountant. You have 3 people in the role, 2 might be overtime eligible, 1 might not be. It's not telling the whole picture. Are they truly doing the same job or not? But there's inherently a risk associated with that. And anyone who's below the salary threshold because they didn't get the memo that their city or their state had a higher one than the federal. And so making sure that there's limited exposure as part of the diligence, or at least identify where that risk is so you can work with legal underprivileged early on. And we were just talking about timing of making changes. Those are changes you may have to make immediately in order to mitigate any inherited risk from the target organization.
Yeah. I remember working a deal, Bobby, and you'll probably appreciate this. I'm sure you've seen quite a bit, but they had an East Coast office and a West Coast office, and the people in a particular role in the West Coast office were hourly, and people doing the exact same job, including folks that had moved between the offices, were salaried in the other office. And we had to go in and correct that. And we asked what the rationale was, and their HR person, who was doing the best job she could. She just didn't understand the compliance. She didn't have the resources of a large acquirer. I think she was doing the best she could in the situation. But her response was, well, everybody in that office wanted to be salaried. And I'm like, not how this works, but cool. At least now we know where you're coming from, and we know what some of the challenges are going to be when we correct this.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone in that office also wanted a raise, but they didn't necessarily do that. But I would be curious, like culturally, we've talked about that a fair amount of how compensation can drive culture. Even having as simple as FLSA status differ between West Coast, East Coast, and having it truly classified as that, did it even feel like one company, or was it kind of 2 business units essentially rivaling the Celtics versus the Lakers?
Well, it wasn't quite that bad, but you're not wrong. It was really interesting. The West Coast office was in San Francisco. They had a keg in the office because public transit made it easy to do a happy hour and not worry about people's safety. Younger population. The East Coast office was in Pennsylvania, and it was a commuter office, right? So folks had to drive in. That meant the happy hours weren't there. Tended to be a slightly older population with or teenagers at home. So you're not wrong. It was a very different way of looking at things in those offices. But I find that to be fairly common when you've got a startup that's only got a couple of locations. They'll take on a different look and feel.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Yeah. So the other thing I'm really curious about, we started off talking about job mapping, and I'd love to get your take on this. When I talk to people in our field, one of the things that we tend to like the least is the process of going in and aligning folks into our architecture, getting all of that lined up. And I hear a lot that this is like the fantasy use case for AI, right? We'd love to be able to train an agent to go in and do that preliminary cut at the mapping. I'm just kind of curious how you see the future of mapping with AI, or even if you've just got some tips for people to do this work in a more efficient way.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's top of mind, I think, at the World at Work conference a couple of weeks ago. Was embedded in most of the conversations there. Something we're doing within KPMG is really developing that AI technology to do that first pass at mapping. And obviously, it's more confident in the mapping. The more information, the more data it has, as well as the more trial runs it has along the way. So trying to make it so that it can, given the consulting, lift and shift across transactions. It's not tied to just one organization's job architecture and their compensation structures. It has a proprietary job architecture algorithm that we use as a bridge. And so no matter what the target organization, how they structure it, it maps into this architecture. The same thing with the buyer organization. And then you can see where the overlap is and going through it that way. And it does that first pass automatically for you in an hour, 2 hours. And in some cases where you have a lot of information that you're feeding it, it is pretty spot on across the board. And it does it consistently across. And so where I found human errors come in, especially when you're dividing and conquering different departments or functional areas, you may go one route in finance and decide the levels are about the same across the two organizations and individual contributors. It's essentially a one-to-one mapping. You move to IT and you didn't understand that that's how they were doing it in finance, but the definitions of the leveling constructs are the same. And now you're actually saying the target organization is always one level below the buyer organization. And now you've created this inconsistency across how you're mapping in that example. And so that's where I find AI to be helpful. One, from an accelerator, but also two, from applying a consistent logic across the board. And then the third piece that even when we're not even using AI that I've found really helpful is using that bridge of a common job architecture and comp structure to bring both organizations into. It takes some of the emotion out of it, where one company is like, no, our accountants are the same level as your accountants. And it goes like that across the board. But when you're anchoring to a definition, there's no visibility yet into how the other side is mapping into that structure. It allows you to get a first pass done with confidence from both sides buy-in of how they view their jobs. You're always then going to have that calibration where there's an emotion, but at least you can tie back to that initial discussion of this is how you viewed this role relative to the structure. This is how they viewed their role relative to the structure. Yes, there's going to be some nuances across both of your roles, but that doesn't mean it's materially a different job or a different level. And so AI was kind of our starting point in using that as the bridge, but we're using it more and more to help alleviate some of that emotion tied to the job mapping and the consequences.
Yeah. What I find is often more challenging than the money is the titling that comes with those changes. I remember a deal several years ago where everybody was getting a raise because our pay mix was different. We were keeping people whole on the base and then giving a dramatic increase in the bonus and equity. Folks were walking away with 35, 40% raises over what they'd had. But because their title was 1 or 2 levels down from what they'd had at a small company where it just didn't align, I thought it was going to be pitchforks and torches. And eventually the company chose to go ahead and just increase the titles, and with that, the pay. And it costs so much money because nobody sat down and transparently explained, well, this is what a principal engineer does in our organization. This is what IT director does in our organization to actually help with that alignment. So that emotionality really carried the day and got very expensive to stop the flight.
Yeah. I mean, it's top of mind, the titles for a lot of organizations, and you even see it within the HCM systems that are out there. Most have been configured and programmed to have two slots for titles. One's the business title that employees can use, what their legacy one was or what they like to use to the street. And one's the internal system title that allows that rigor of truly harmonizing them and having integrity in your data and reporting around it. And so you see it within deals, you see it around job architecture transformations of how are you actually going to adjust their titles or not. And to your point, honestly, I see more grandfathering of titles than I do even compensation because they are so meaningful for employees. And so you'll wait until someone gets promoted into that title.
Right.
Or there's natural attrition over time. And so you build in that system title integrity along the way. And eventually the workforce dynamic shifts enough that you then have that hygiene. But it is a very sensitive topic for a lot of organizations and people where you see the grandfathering happen a fair amount.
Well, it's such a big piece of identity, right? It's in a lot of ways who we are in the workforce is reflected in the title. And I think companies sometimes underestimate just how important that is at the individual level.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about pay mix, but I would love to dive into that a little bit more. So if we've got a couple of firms coming together, one's focused on base and bonus. The other one is, say, base plus. I see this a lot with startups with options and equity that may or may not ever come to fruition if there's a liquidity event, but people get really attached to that equity component, but the buyer doesn't give equity at that level, right? So I see these kinds of issues come up when looking at pay mix. How do you approach bridging those kinds of differences?
Yeah. And you talked about it early on. Sometimes it looks clean to just say, hey, we're going to buy out a third of your LTI, put it into your salary. It's guaranteed. Perception should be higher and more valued in the base salary. Should feel like you're not losing anything.
Right.
And makes sense. But what you lose is that feeling that they joined that startup to truly build something and have that ownership mentality. And so having that piece of equity, even though it might have been a small piece of their pay, and they may be better off financially with how you're doing it in the spreadsheet, they lose that element of it. And so thinking about why, again, you're doing this transaction. Are you buying this organization for their customers, their technology and IP, for their employees and their skill sets and their talent? And a lot of times the decisions may shift, that it is as simple as that spreadsheet exercise, and you'll deal with the ramifications if you're buying them for their IP and you're not as focused on the employees.
Right.
But if you're really focused on the employees, you might have to get creative. And so one example that really forced that creativity was that entrepreneurial spirit that was seen throughout the organization. Everyone received equity, no matter how small, even folks in various international jurisdictions where it wasn't typically part of compensation in their market. It was embedded in their culture, their values, and their compensation programs. And so ultimately, what we ended up doing was we held town halls, we held different workshops, listening to the employees of what they really wanted, while still working with the buyer to understand what are they trying to do, because there is naturally that friction.
Right.
And so what we ended up coming up with was we took away their LTI, we harmonized their bonus incentive targets, and so brought folks up a little bit. But what was now allowed, not even just for the target organization employees, but also the buyer, was they were allowed to elect to defer a portion of that bonus into long-term incentives. So what you've done is you've shifted the pay mix to what historically the buyer wanted, but now you've allowed that entrepreneurial spirit to live on in the employees that value it the most, where they want to start electing it. And so took a lot of listening, took a lot of conversations, took a lot of education upon the rollout of what it meant and how does the deferral work. But what we saw was lower attrition through that, with the target organization than they had seen with their last 4 acquisitions at that buyer. And so naturally, there was an element of satisfaction and pride that they were able to keep that really important aspect of their culture through their pay programs.
I love that. And that meant that the buyer had to be flexible and willing to do right by the employees. That's great. Well, Bobby, as we get close to time here, what's one action HR or comp leaders can take early on to set the stage for a smoother transition?
I think having a seat at the table. I talked about due diligence a fair amount. Not every HR team is under the tent to know that the deal's happening, but then it's more of a scramble and they're focusing on how are we going to make day one operationally happen. Getting in early, doing the diligence, looking holistically, what are windfall payments, where are their flight risks with retention, what does the compensation and benefits look like as you line them up side by side, what are the cultural differences, and then making sure that HR truly understands the deal thesis and the guiding principles of it. Are they going to integrate on day one just from a business perspective, or is this going to be more of a hold for 3 years and then figure out what you're going to do? A lot of those deal theses should drive how you're making pay decisions. And so making sure HR is under the tent early, understanding the big picture, and then getting into the detail early so that they have a plan laid out and it's less of a scramble and less reactionary throughout the diligence process, sign to close process, post-close process. And it makes, honestly, the tough decisions that much easier when there's a clear truth being linked across all of those things.
It's fantastic. I know that we've barely scratched the surface. We could probably spend a day or two talking about some of the nuances of comp, but I think this really helps with a baseline and some deeper information for folks that have maybe just done a couple of deals or are ready to jump into their first one. So really appreciate you sharing all of these great insights. Bobby, where can people connect with you or follow your work?
So LinkedIn is obviously a great tool out there. So Bobby Berkowitz on LinkedIn, it's the Robert Berkowitz 8. If you need to type it into the URL there. I like to do a lot of different thought leadership, whether it's attending, speaking at conferences, or publishing different papers out there. Clint closely as well, as you're an active member of the community. And so logging into LinkedIn, following along as we're sharing different thought leadership trends in the market is a great way to stay connected on what's the latest, not only in compensation, AI, but everything we've talked about today.
Perfect. And we'll make sure that we put a link in the show notes for folks that'd like to connect with you. Well, Bobby, thank you again. Really appreciate your wisdom and insight here.
Thank you, Clint. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Clint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.